asked a friend recently what the worst movie he's ever seen was, and he said The Hills Have Eyes Part 2. And so I had to ask him which one he was referring to. It's both funny and sad how there are two movies called The Hills Have Eyes Part 2, and they're both god-awful. Even though it pains me as a horror fan to talk about sequels to remakes of original films that already had sequels, I thought I would take a fresh look at both sequels to Wes Craven's 1977 shocker that put suburbanites against cannibalistic savages to see which film is actually worse. For anybody that needs proof of Wes Craven's inconsistent track record, just keep in mind that both A Nightmare on Elm Street and The Hills Have Eyes Part 2 were released in 1984. The majority of Hills was shot before production commenced for Nightmare, and it wasn't until Freddy became a box office winner that Craven was pressured to finish it, which he actually never did. A Nightmare on Elm Street made him a godfather of modern horror and introduced one of the most iconic monsters ever. But Hills Have Eyes Part 2, on the other hand, was so atrocious that even Craven disowned it and stated that he only did it to raise money for Nightmare. But the finished product doesn't seem like your typical whatever, let's just get it over with cash grab sequel, because one thing it does not do is play it safe. The dialogue and characters are as idiotic as humanly possible, the villains so cartoonish and non-threatening that there's a good chance that Craven was hoping to make it a comedy. I have no idea. This film is mostly known for having the audacity to give a dog its own flashback scene, but that is just one of the many, many perplexing atrocities. You have to give Craven a little credit for making such a baffling film that is virtually unexplainable. The first, The Hills Have Eyes Part 2, gives you things to think about and mock, and with the right group of people, could lend itself to a fun movie night. Even on a brand new Blu-ray transfer, right from the start, it's clear that this is going to be an ugly and cheap-looking movie. Before we get to Beast the Dog's flashback, we have to revisit three other scenes from the original film involving survivors Bobby and Ruby, which were obviously inserted just to give the film a respectable running time. Bobby is legitimately troubled and haunted by the horrific events that destroyed his family, and has weekly psychiatric visits. He and his now civilized mutant girlfriend Ruby have invented a new super formula fuel that is expected to take the motocross sport by storm, but Bobby is too traumatized to attend its unveiling because the race is too close to Ruby's hometown. Ruby tags along with the racing team in an RV and is clearly shaken up once her friends start cracking morbid jokes about how close they are to the family of Jupiter's hideout. When the subject of the cannibal daughter is brought up, one of the guys says, "Oh yeah, she killed her brothers to save the tourist. Forgot about her." And then we logically get a close-up of Ruby's panicked face as it dissolves into a flashback. In the most absurd revelation imaginable, it's revealed that every single one of them has forgotten to set their clocks back an hour because of daylight savings time, and they're now at the risk of forfeiting their chances to compete in the big race. And this is the reason why they take that fateful shortcut through the desert. Things only get worse when a character that was so terrifying in the original film shows up and makes a surprise attack on Ruby. This petite girl kicks Pluto's ass and makes him look like a chump. When he runs away, Ruby decides that it's finally time to reveal to her friends about who she really is. This should have been a really dramatic and exciting scene, but the dialogue and reactions remain clumsier than ever, and the fact that Ruby belonged to this clan who viciously killed Bobby's family does nothing to change her friend's jokey, implausible demeanor. After all, as Shane reminds everybody, this isn't Panic City! Speaking of the gorgeous Jane, you got to credit her for finding a way to give us the obligatory 80s shower scene, even though she's in a creepy, unlocked barn in the middle of nowhere and her friends are disappearing left and right. When Pluto isn't making funny faces and getting beaten up with wrestling moves like hip tosses and sunset flips, he builds up a character called the Reaper, who is supposedly even more menacing and dangerous than Jupiter ever was. But we later find out that the wacky, grunting Reaper can't even compete with the blind woman who is trapped inside his own mineshaft. My favorite moment involving the least frightening villain in horror cinema history has to be when he spots an obvious trap and says, "Ha ha! Reaper don't get fooled like Papa Jupe, oh no!" And then Roy makes his first smart observation in the whole movie by yelling, "The Reaper sucks!" While The Hills Have Eyes Part 2 is incompetent in every aspect, it's a fun movie to discuss. The second Hills Have Eyes Part 2 doesn't garner as much discussion or interpretation because it gives us nothing to think about afterwards. It's a one-dimensional, cynical, and mean-spirited offering that the few people who saw it wish they could have immediately forgotten about. Alexander Aja followed up his hugely successful High Tension with the remake of The Hills Have Eyes, to which he also wrote the screenplay along with Gregory Levasseur. He brings a real urgency and intensity to the direction, and while it's a pretty upsetting movie to sit through, it's one of the better horror remakes we've gotten in the past 10 years. I was exhausted and numb by the end because the film goes a little too far in how much violence and depravity it inflicts upon a suburban family that includes teenage kids and a baby, but I can't deny that the build-up was suspenseful and the action scenes exciting as hell. Much like the original had an appealing, unlikely hero in Martin Spear, Aaron Stanford was outstanding in the role of Doug. Considering the unimaginable hell that the survivors of this movie were put through, it was a real bullshit move that the final shot indicates that they might not be safe after all but assuring a sequel. The father-son duo of Wes and Jonathan Craven teamed up to write the screenplay for the sequel to the remake, which has the New Mexican mutants hunting a more formidable group than the stranded suburban family, the National Guard. However, these members of the military are still in training, so they haven't learned that when your comrades are getting massacred one by one in the middle of nowhere, it's probably not a good idea to take a piss break without telling anybody. Sent to the hills to deliver supplies to the scientists installing a surveillance system for the Department of Defense, it doesn't take long until they receive cryptic staticky messages from their walkie-talkies that suggest that they might be performing a search and rescue mission instead. Two of the reservists stay behind to protect the supplies, and the film gains a little traction once their only mode of transportation explodes and their only mode of protection is stolen. It's an interesting idea to have the mutants square off against the US military, since the use of nuclear weapons is what's responsible for their uncivilized behavior and mutated appearances in the first place. Wes Craven has stated in numerous interviews that while he never intended this to be a political picture, he felt that considering what was happening historically with the war in Iraq and the fight against terrorism, it would be interesting for the characters to be American kids in uniform. But all traces of allegories and commentary are buried beneath obnoxious and boring characters, cheap jump scares, and crude dialogue where nearly every line is full of phony bravado and foul language. It's hard to sympathize with any character whose typical line of dialogue goes something like, Rambo, resurrect my balls, bitch! We were genuinely concerned about the Carter family in the remake because they seemed like real people who unwittingly entered a horribly dangerous place, and the things that happened to them felt visceral and unfair. Here we just get cocky protagonist armed with machine guns, whose witty exchanges go something like, my leg's asleep, your dick's asleep, wanna wake it up? No, that's your daddy's job. Ugh. Well, the first Hills Have Eyes Part 2 was a total debacle that nothing short of an entire reshoot could have helped. This one could have been greatly improved if Wes Craven had stuck to his original idea of having one of the mutants enter the real world. I would have loved to see a scene where the mutant with the heart of gold, I think his name is Hansel, if he had escaped the hills to either be interrogated by officials or introduced to modern civilization, that could have been very interesting. 6 months before The Hills Have Eyes Part 2 hit theaters in March of 2003, horror audiences had to endure the nauseating sight of Leatherface being born in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre at the beginning. But the birthing scene in this movie is even harder to look at, when an imprisoned young woman gets slaughtered right after she's forced to painfully squeeze out her mutant rape child. Also in the first act is the sight of a severely wounded man literally crawling out of a disgusting desert porta potty. The film trades off unpleasant visuals like these with predictable scenes in which we're just waiting for the next character to bite the dust, and yet we're supposed to chuckle when one of the mutants waves to a soldier falling off a cliff using the arm it just cut off. Also, there are 2 female soldiers in the cast, and of course they both look like freshly showered supermodels, so the mutant rape scenes will be more titillating. I will take dog flashbacks any day over this garbage. I will say that this film was shot pretty well, and it has some impressive set pieces and action scenes and makeup effects, but I will never watch it again. Whereas the 1984 Hills of Ice Part 2, I might watch in 10 years or so. It might be one of those, it's so bad it's good movies. I'm still completely baffled by it.